Perth is a large Australian city with more than 2 million inhabitants. Its urban origins date back to the 19th century, so it is a relatively young metropolis with great potential for further development. Huge, extending on a flat area of the city's plains, it is a good and charming place to live. But at the same time, it brings completely new challenges to its feet. The most important thing is isolation. Perth is an extremely isolated city, and it has either desert or water around it. The inhabitants of this city are closer to Singapore than to Sydney, so the citizens of Asia have strongly fueled the number of migrants in recent years. Despite its long distances, Perth is considered a charming and comfortable city that will not hide in the clouds. But evil was born in these intricate streets and low buildings, which brought unlikely terror to the city. His victims are remembered and talked about to this day. During the 1950s and 1960s, Perth was considered not only a quiet city, but also a very safe one. The residents didn't lock the door at the key. They also often left windows open. They completely ignored the possibility that someone might break into their homes and hurt them. They knew their neighbors well and trusted each other. But it all changed in 1959. Nina Bergman, actually Patricia Greek, was born in Melbourne. In 1949, she married Gary Bergman, a Jew, and married him in the synagogue. She changed her faith and became Mrs. Nina. The couple had a son, Mark, but nevertheless, the love did not stand the test of time. After 6 years, the marriage ceased to exist, and the woman and the child moved to Perth. She lived in the suburbs of Nedlands. She was very popular in the area, as was her son. Nina wanted to start a completely new life, so she didn't talk much about her ex-husband, as well as about her past. She focused on raising Mark. She soon met a Greek radio DJ, Fotis, with whom she had an intimate relationship. The couple began to meet regularly, and everything indicated that the lives of the women had regained harmony and peace. These dreams of a new beginning were brutally interrupted on the night of January 1959. The woman, like most of the inhabitants of Perth, slept by an open window. It was used by an assailant who slipped inside. Initially, he started searching the apartment in the hope of finding some precious things. But when he found nothing, he went into Nina's bedroom. The woman woke up and saw a strange man rushing at her. He started beating her, and she, in response, scratched and struck the blind. Eventually, the intruder grabbed a 17-centimeter knife and stabbed the woman into the body. He repeated this, and then again and again. Nina didn't have any chances. The 33-year-old died in her own bedroom, and her naked, bloody body was found by a partner. The cops had no idea who might be behind this crime. They assumed, however, that this was a single case, which is unlikely to happen again in the future. They didn't even realize how wrong they were. The terror behind which one man stood was just beginning. At the end of 1959, Gillian Brewer, 22 years old, the heiress of Fortuna from Melbourne, became the target of the murderer. Before the attacker decided to attack, he first followed the woman and watched her every step. Finally, in the middle of the night, he entered her house, holding a hatch in his hand. Gillian was asleep, unaware of the imminent danger. The killer lifted up his blade and started hitting his victim. When the woman stopped breathing, the man, as if he had never gone to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator and took out the lemonade. He poured it into the glass and went out to the porch. After drinking, he went back to the bedroom where Jill was already dead. He grabbed the nearby scissors and began to chew the bodies. It's as if the previous injury caused by the ex was too small a penalty. After this attack, the killer remained silent for years. It was only later that it became clear why. In 1960, he was sentenced to prison for bribery. He was sentenced to hard work. In 1963, the police warned of a growing scale of burglaries and assaults. He stood next to the victim and fired a single shot into her head. He left Brian unconscious, believing he had another murder behind him. On leaving the house, he took the victim's car. Brian was found by a friend. The man was lying in a bunch of blood, but he was still alive. However, the injuries he suffered made him disabled. He lived 3 more years before he died of an epileptic attack. The attack on Brian wasn't the last one that night. The killer went to the Netherlands, where he left his car and started walking through the picturesque streets in search of another victim. Then he noticed an 18-year-old student, John Stark. The boy slept on the veranda of the guest house on Vincent Street. It was an exceptionally hot night, even for Australian conditions, so the teenager decided to sleep outdoors. The bloodthirsty killer stole himself and fired from a close distance, after which he quickly disappeared into the darkness. A friend found John seriously wounded. Despite immediate medical attention, the boy was unable to be rescued. He died in the hospital. Another attack was insufficient for the killer. A few blocks further, he chose the next target. With a loaded rifle, he stood in front of the house where the 59-year-old salesman, George Walmsley, lived. The killer knocked at the door and waited with his gun until the host opened it. When George appeared in front of the attacker, he quickly picked up his gun and shot the man in the head. The noise awoke Walmsley's wife and daughter. The woman found her husband lying at the door. There was no trace of the assailant, and George was immediately taken to the hospital. Unfortunately, he died in the hospital an hour later. The police knew that all the events that took place on the night of January 27th were interlinked and feared that an armed madman would strike again. They warned all inhabitants of Perth to shut their doors for the night and asked to report any suspicious activities. The attacks that the assailant carried out that one night shocked the people. They were accustomed to a peaceful and secure life, and now they had to find themselves in a new reality. Some of them started buying guard dogs, others slept with baseball sticks or laid knives next to their beds. The fear was so great that the residents were afraid to open the door even to the police. During this time, the killer was hiding and watching the panic he was sowing in the city. He was convinced that the police would not follow him because the crimes he was committing were difficult to combine. He was incalculable and, more importantly, his motives remained unclear. This made the officers still believe that they were dealing with different perpetrators all the time. There was another attack on the 9th of February, although no one initially associated it with the January shootings. Rosemary Anderson was coming home from meeting her boyfriend. Then she was hit by a car. She couldn't be saved. The police quickly found the culprit. She stopped Rosemary's boyfriend, Jean Baton, because his car had an injection that, according to the investigators, matched the trace left after a man crashed. Interestingly, the boy allegedly confessed guilt and was sentenced to 10 years in prison for involuntary killing. It is not until years later that it is revealed that a tragic mistake has occurred. On February 16th, a few days after Rosemary's death, an unknown perpetrator broke into a house in the west of the city. There was a social worker, Lucy Madrill, 24, who lived there. The woman was asleep when the assailant broke in. He tried to move smoothly, but unwittingly overturned the picture in the frame. Awakening Lucy, she saw a man standing in her room. Frightened, she yelled and tried to escape, but the robber was faster. He pushed her to bed, wrapped her neck with a night lamp cable, and choked her. When Lucy stopped breathing, the killer sexually exploited her body, and after all, pulled it onto the lawn and laid it in front of the neighbor's house. There he had sex with dead bodies again. Before he ran away, he put a bottle of whiskey beside the woman. He probably wanted to get the investigators to believe that the woman was drunk to death. The neighbors found Lucy's body the next day. The cops were helpless. The ongoing investigation has not answered the question of who is behind all the macabre events in Perth. The officers were sure, however, that it was not the same person who killed Jill Brower, because a man, Daryl Bemis, who was deaf, had already been convicted in this case. The man had already been accused of watching young women. When he was arrested for the murder of his heiress, he didn't even understand what was going on around him. His interrogation lasted less than an hour. He was immediately tried and sentenced. He was supposed to be hanged, but his sentence was later changed to life sentence. In August of the same year, 18-year-old student Shirley MacLeod took care of Carl and Wendy's son. It was night, the child was asleep, and the girl decided to teach. Sitting over the books, she fell asleep and couldn't hear when an intruder entered the house. He approached the teenager, pulled out the gun, and shot her in the head. Shirley died right away. Her body was found by a married couple who returned home last night. Their son was still asleep, not even awakened by a gunshot. The media was scratching about unexplained crimes. The attacker responsible for the January shooting was interchangeably called a monster, with a Nedlands or a nighttime interlocutor. The tension in the city was felt at every step, and the residents were afraid to leave their homes. So the police had a huge responsibility, and they knew that very well. A fingerprint was found in the house where the 18-year-old Shirley was killed. The investigators decided to take an unprecedented step in Australia. They carried out mass tests among the inhabitants. From 30,000 men linked to the murder area, fingerprints were taken. However, the disappointment was enormous because none of the samples matched the traces secured at the crime scene. The police, however, did not give up. They checked over 60,000 weapons to match the bullet to that 18-year-old girl found in her head. It didn't work either. The breakthrough that everyone was waiting for came when a woman called the police. She said she saw a hidden rifle in the bushes. Officers immediately headed to the specified place and they actually found a weapon there. It was immediately secured for testing because it corresponded to the previously prepared characteristics. In the bushes where she was, the police hid an illusory rifle. The officers were expecting him to come back for his weapons to go hunting again. Near the Ear Street set up an observation point and patiently waited for the owner of the weapon to appear. Their perseverance has been rewarded. 17 days later, at about 1 p.m., a car arrived in the vicinity of the rifle's hiding place. A man came out of it, and he took a step towards the bushes. Then the police got out of the hiding place and arrested the suspect. It was Eric Edgar Cooke. In his car, 22 caliber shells were found, matching a rifle hidden in the bushes. Moreover, after a thorough examination of the weapons, the investigators had no doubts. That's what killed 18-year-old Shirley. Cooke was charged with murder. During the hearing, the man admitted guilt. He also revealed that he had a lot of burglaries and assaults on his account, a total of 250. Cooke also showed a remarkable memory. He was able to reproduce what and from which house he stole, and even exactly how much money he took. Listening to his stories, the police began to look at him more and more suspiciously. In fact, there has been an assumption that a man may have on his conscience much more than one murder. Finally, Detective Max Baker asked directly if Cooke had taken someone else's life, and so began his confession. He confessed to 20 violent crimes, including the Australian Day shooting. Cooke's been testifying for a total of 3 weeks, driving with the police to the crime scene and telling all the details that he remembered perfectly. On the only surviving recording of the murderer's voice, Cooke spoke of how many strikes he had fired and what parts of his body he had targeted. His speeches are vague, mainly because of the deformity of his face. Eric had a rabbit lip, which in his childhood was operated quite inadequately. Cooke admitted to beating 7 women. The first was Nell Schneider, whom he saw in 1958. While she was riding a bicycle, he deliberately hit her and then ran away. The woman was seriously injured, but she survived. He also confessed that he killed Rosemary Anderson on the road, whose boyfriend was serving a sentence for allegedly causing the girl's death. Eric was extremely honest with the investigators. He admitted that with each attack he needed more emotion. The violence he showed increased with each attack. He was constantly looking for the method of killing that would satisfy him the most. That's why he was so unpredictable. From break-in assaults to driving into people, shooting, hauling, or choking. With every murder, he was getting better and better, but he was also getting more and more dissatisfied. The trial began at the end of November 1963. In the courtroom, a man tried to convince him that he was illiterate. his lawyers have adopted a similar line of defense. They assured that the man was suffering from schizophrenia, but the ordered psychiatric tests did not confirm these words. The experts said that he is healthy and can be held accountable for his actions. The trial itself took place in an extremely strange atmosphere. Cooke kept laughing and joking, not showing any conscientious reproach. On the contrary, he seemed to be proud of what he had done. Eric's trial lasted only 3 days. The jury had no doubts. The man was guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. Cooke did not intend to appeal, but his words were that he was responsible for the deaths of Gillian and Rosemary. But the judge found that Cooke was doing this only to get another investigation started, which would mean that the killer's execution would be postponed. So Eric ended up in the same prison where Daryl and John were sitting, innocently serving sentences for the crimes of a monster from the Netherlands. Today, this seems macabre and absurd. Interestingly, even before he was arrested, Eric had come to Daryl's trial and watched a man be convicted of a crime he had not committed. Probably because he felt extremely confident. Serial killers very often think of themselves as superhuman. They are convinced that their intelligence is much higher than that of most people. Therefore, they are provoking and crossing further boundaries, which sooner or later lead to their capture. John Button hasn't been cleared of charges. He was released after 5 years for good conduct. The first thing he did after leaving the prison was to visit the cemetery. He visited the grave of the girl who was murdered by Cooke. Even before the execution, Eric assured him that he was responsible for the deaths of Gillian and Rosemary. He also repeated this to the pastor, whom he knew from his youth. He then laid his hand on the Bible and said, "I swear to God Almighty, it was I who killed them." Although there was already a strong demand in Western Australia at the time for the abolition of the death penalty, there was virtually no protest in the case of Edgar, except for one woman who was guarding the prison gate on the day he was executed. The monster of the Netherlands was hanged at 8 a.m. on October 26, 1964. He rested in the cemetery right next to the child killer Marty Rendell, who was the last woman in Western Australia to be sentenced to death. It is impossible to talk about Eric's story today without analyzing his childhood because it was not easy and without a doubt had a huge impact on who later became a complex boy rejected by everyone. Cooke was born in Perth on February 26, 1931. He was the eldest of 3 brothers and sisters. His father, Vivian Thomas Cooke, worked as a salesman in a store. Her mother, Christine, was a Scottish immigrant. The couple got married when the woman got pregnant. Eric's birth did not bring joy to the marriage. On the contrary, the father could not look at his child, who was born with a rabbit's lip and a split sky. All subsequent surgeries did not bring the expected effect and the boy grew up with a visible facial deformity. He also had trouble speaking clearly. He quickly became the subject of bullying and abuse by his peers. He also faced violence every day in his own home. The father was an aggressive alcoholic who spilled his frustration on his son. It happened that the boy slept on the street because he was afraid to be under the same roof as his cat father. The boy also frequently went to children's homes and surrogate families, but eventually, he always returned to his family home. Because of the serious injuries that resulted in visits to hospitals, Eric suffered from severe headaches. He was shy and complicated, and he felt extremely lonely. The only world he knew was filled with alcohol, violence, and rejection. At that time, evil began to grow in him. At the age of 6, he was expelled from school for theft. He took the money from the teacher's purse. Eric changed schools a total of 4 times, but it was the same in every institution. He became a training bag for other students who abused him mentally and physically. Eventually, at the age of 14, Cooke completely abandoned his studies and grabbed casual classes. He started working, among other things, as a supplier in a grocery store. However, the money was not enough to sustain himself and his mother, whom he helped financially. The father spent all the money that the woman earned on alcohol, so the maintenance of the house fell on Eric, so the boy started stealing both food and money. He gave everything to his mother. Cooke didn't have any problems with learning before he left school. He was smart and brilliant. He also had a photographic memory. But because he spoke vaguely, no one listened to what he had to say. This was the case both in class and later in life. When he was 16, he started working in a forge. It wasn't easy. He suffered several hand burns. Still, every time he went back to class, he needed money. He was hardworking and determined to provide his mother with the best possible life. After all, he was always standing up for her when her father wanted to beat her. One day, a man slapped the boy so hard that he was taken to the hospital with a broken skull. Eric didn't admit to the doctors that it was his father's fault. He lied about having a fight with his peers. At the age of 17, he was sentenced to 18 months in prison for attempting to burn a church. Earlier, he was not accepted into the choir, and therefore, in revenge, he decided to burn the temple. After his release, he fell even more into the world of theft and burning, which led to his return to prison. He was also in a psychiatric hospital because of these headaches and loss of consciousness. After his release, he was taken care of by the Methodist pastor, George Jenkins. He let him come to the church, talked to them, and gave advice. But the criminal life was more important to Eric, and he soon robbed the temple. When he was 21, Cooke joined the army. That's where he learned how to shoot. However, before his military career began to flourish, he was expelled from service. The superiors learned that he had been sentenced earlier, and this prevented him from continuing his activities in the army. Despite his many problems, Eric managed to make a closer acquaintance with a 19-year-old waitress, Sally Levin. The couple soon married, and in the following years, they had a total of 7 children, 4 sons and 3 daughters. The oldest boy was mentally impaired, and the other one had a deformed arm. This exacerbated his frustration. He claimed that life was exceptionally cruel to him. Having a family did not cause Eric to abandon his criminal activity. On the contrary, she absorbed it more and more. He turned small-scale robbery into a house break-in. Before he entered the building, he first made sure it was empty for at least the whole night. Then he had time to look around the rooms and pick up the most valuable items. He also began to follow young women, watch them, and sometimes he got stuck. He took advantage of the fact that most people thought he wasn't too brilliant, and so he allowed himself more and more. The break-in was easy because, as I said at the beginning, at that time, the people of Perth didn't pay much attention to security. They left the door open, not suspecting anyone could use it. Eric walked the streets, looked at the houses, and so he picked his next targets. Later, already in the investigation, he admitted that over time he began to care only about hurting someone. And that's what happened when, in 1959, he took someone's life for the first time. Eric's case came out again when a journalist from Perth, Estelle Blackburn, decided to deal with the case of the wrongfully convicted for Cooke's crimes. Daryl and John were not acquitted, despite the martyrer's confession. In her book, Broken Lives, she called on the Western Australian court to reconsider the case. So, once again, we analyzed the evidence collected earlier, and it turned out that the wreckage in John's car was not caused by a human crash. A reconstruction of the events was also carried out in 2000, and it was proved that the man could not be responsible for the death of his girlfriend. Moreover, it was established that the description of the events he presented in the 1960s, Cooke, perfectly matched the injuries that Rosemary suffered. The conviction of John Batten was revoked on the 25th of February 2002. A similar fate encountered Daryl Bemis. In 2005, he was acquitted of the murder of Jill. He also received compensation of almost $500,000 Australian dollars, as did John. The Nedlands monster in Australia, and especially in Perth, is still spoken of today. First of all, because he was the most brutal killer in this part of the world, but also because his story continued many years later. In some houses to this day, it is known to say close the door, close the windows, in case Cookie comes. Like, share, subscribe for more.